My name is Harriet Broad, Dr. Harriet Broad. I'm a big formal, and I work as a hypnotherapist, psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and I also write articles in various journals. And what I'm here to talk about is while the economic disaster was built on the model with which you're so familiar, a personal disaster, closely related personal disaster, was happening as well. I'm not an economic determinist. I don't think things move just because of economics, but they have a lot to do with it, and I'll explain what I'm talking about, which I hope makes sense. So, the same forces that were responsible for the disaster of the U.S. economy today also helped to contribute to decimating intimate and personal relationships in the United States, which are in pretty sick shape, as well as decimating the social networks that used to support individuals and communities, like community groups, like unions, like political movements that had some vitality. There has been really the equivalent of a class transformation, a class revolution in personal relationships in the United States. And since that is the only revolution that's happened in the United States recently, and it's been a revolutionary transformation that has not been realized, but nonetheless, it's changed the entire landscape of personal relationships. How has that worked? You're all familiar with the 1820 to 1970, wages and productivity rising in tandem, and then wages being frozen. Well, at that point began a process of personal and family unit disorganization that I'm going to address, as well as community disorganization. So, what happened? Well, as this process was happening, whatever happened got an enormous kick forward by Bush. Because of the commingling of one's sense of self with one's self-worth and net worth, which came from having the ability to do better with every generation, American sense of value, personal value, has been cut with their wages since 1970. And as people define themselves and their self-worth through their ability to consume, and as that ability deteriorated, so did people's self-worth. What happened was that starting in 1970, with cut wages, family desperation pushed women en masse into the labor force. In 1940, women were already up in employment because of employment in war factories, but in 1940, with a big push for women's employment, was reduced by 1970 as women were pushed out of the labor force in order to accommodate to returning troops. But in 1970, 40% of American women were working in the labor force outside of the home, most of them part-time. By the year 2000, 77% of American women were working outside the home, most part-time. That's a huge transformation. And not only were women working outside of the home, but they were working out of the home with ever more scarce assistance from the government in terms of child care, after-school programs, park maintenance, tutoring services, public daycare. For example, in 1945, there were more public daycare centers than there are now. And elder programs, there were many more quality programs for everybody. So women were pushed out of the labor force without the supports that would allow families and relationships to flourish. So as women left the labor force, they found that their own labor had its own costs. Not only the obvious ones of work clothes and transportation, but also the cost of purchasing some of the goods and services that women's labor always purchased for free, You can see the difference now. It used to be women made their own bread. It was worth nothing. Now you pay $3 for, homemade bread. So what happened was that the cost of what women used to produce for free became a cost on families. And just to give you an idea of the latest figures, which are that the stay-at-home mother, if the stay-at-home mother were replaced in the United States with all paid services, the cost would be $116,805 a year. And if the domestic services and child care services of a working mom who work outside of the home were all purchased, that would cost the family $68,406 a year. So families were still hurting even though women were in the labor force. And adolescents were also pushed into the labor force as the culture of advertising and commodities changed, making it important to have Nike sneakers. When I was a little girl, 100 years ago, you got sneakers. You didn't get Nike sneakers or Adidas sneakers, you got jeans. It didn't matter what the brand was, it was irrelevant. And childhood wasn't commodified. And so that families didn't have the expenses of brand names. So working women are now unable to not only perform the physical labor in the household that they always did, but they're also unable to perform the emotional labor. The emotional labor of making people feel good about themselves, taking care of people as if one wants to, giving them the sense of being important and wanted and needed. Now, so at this point, let's go to 1970. In 1970, the big division starts happening that Professor Wolff has talked about a lot. Well, one of the things that happened was America was on the road to being the most equal or egalitarian nation in 1970, the most egalitarian nation of all the Western industrialized nations. It achieved what it has now, which is the least egalitarian nation. And that has enormous ramifications. The World Health Organization last week put out a big study showing that the biggest predictor of mental illness is life in a society of gross inequality. So that as the inequality burgeoned, so did Americans' emotional deterioration. So by the time Bush took over in 2000, there was a crisis of this volatile combination of reduced salaries, accelerated debt, women strained and stressed. And I think Bush won the election in 2000, aside from probably doing some stealing. He also sold a fantasy. The fantasy that the man was in charge, but he could no longer be because he couldn't afford to support his household. The fantasy that America was still king of the world when our economy was no longer king of the world. We still had military might, but little else to show that we were king. And we had already, even in terms of military might, we'd already lost the war in Vietnam. And that that America was king, the family was great. That's pretty much Palin and McCain's appeal too. But families were in trouble then and are even more badly in trouble now. Because what used to sustain a family emotionally and physically was women's full-time emotional and domestic labor in producing a household, in making people feel safe, in providing cleanliness and cooked food and a sense of well-being and being wanted, as well as a social network. It's women